Well, hello to whoever has taken the time to watch this video. I'm Jeff Roberts. I'm the chair of the history department at Tennessee Tech, and a few months ago I had the pleasure of talking to you for 5 weeks about World War II. And when I was invited back, I thought some things I could think about and what I could talk about, and obviously I was confused as to what I should do. And I finally decided, there was one part of World War II that I left out that would be kind of perfect for a 30-minute talk. And it's only the most important battle in the Pacific War. We spent a day about the origins of the war, we spent a day about the end of the war, but I left out this rather incredibly important event about the Battle of Midway. And I thought I could do that battle justice in this amount of time, because I don't have to give you a whole lot of prelude to Midway. There's really only two things you really need to know going forward. Okay, Midway happened in June. There's one event in April and one event in May. And if you've got those two, you're well on your way. The event in April was the Doolittle Raid. You've probably heard of it. It was a revenge strike. It had no great strategic import, at least not initially. It was an attack by 16 B-25 bombers who took off from a carrier, bombed Japan, and then flew on to China. It was designed to lift spirits back home. It was a morale raid, designed to sort of tell Japan, take that. Sort of a punch to the face, but again, not expecting to do any kind of real strategic damage. It's a wonderful story. There's lots of heroic stories individually. There's a very touching tribute aspect to it, in that the survivors used to get together and raise toasts to each other for many, many years. It's a wonderful personal story. It actually has a deeper significance. Bombers had to take off early. They bombed Japan as best they could. They basically threw their bombs all over the place. Most of them got in the vicinity of Tokyo. But as fate or luck or God would have it, and standing here in the room with pictures of Jesus and John Wesley, I have to tell you, I have to be honest, it's hard for a historian to tell when something is dumb luck and when something is God's will. And so, just like I always tell my students, it's your call. I'll accept either answer. But I'll tell you up front, there are a lot of things about the whole Battle of Midway story that seem remarkably fortunate. Here's the first one. Some of the bombs from the Doolittle Raiders happened to fall very close to Emperor Hirohito's palace. It's not deliberate, but it happened. The Japanese High Command took that as a mortal affront. They assumed the Americans had been trying to kill the emperor, to whom they were sworn to be loyal. They determined they had to prevent any such raid from ever happening again. It's because of that the Japanese Navy's High Command dreamed up this plan to capture Midway Island. They felt that if they could do that, they could close what they called the keyhole to those Doolittle-like raids. So the plan begins as a result of this episode. I said the second thing you need to know happened in the month of May. Doolittle Raid was April 18th. Between May the 4th and May the 8th, there's another naval battle fought called the Battle of the Coral Sea. Coral Sea is significant for a number of reasons in its own right. For one, it was the first naval battle ever in which the ships never saw each other. In fact, they never came within 200 miles of each other. All of the attacking was done by aircraft. One group of carriers launching attacks against the other group of carriers, so forth. Coral Sea is significant for another reason. It was the first time the Americans gave the Japanese more than a temporary setback. The battle forced the Japanese to give up on their plans to land troops on the southern side of New Guinea. Here's probably the only place where I wish I had a map, but it's not that big a deal, because what happened was the Japanese ended up landing on the northern side of New Guinea as a result of this battle and attempting to march across, which proved to be an absolute disaster for them, because New Guinea may well be the most inhospitable place on earth. They suffered tremendously trying to make that march. Beyond that, Coral Sea was also significant in terms of the losses. On paper, it looks like pretty much a draw. Both sides lost one carrier, and both sides had one carrier damaged. On our side, the USS Lexington went down. Basically, fires broke out. We were unable to control the fires. The crew had to abandon ship. And the carrier Yorktown was ours that was damaged. Yorktown limped on back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. That's your situation going forward toward the Battle of Midway. Now, there are a lot of things I'll tell you about Midway in the next 20 minutes. But if you don't remember anything else, remember this. The roles are completely reversed from Pearl Harbor. At Pearl Harbor, the Americans were cocky. The Japanese came up with a detailed plan that proved more effective than we realized. At Midway, the roles are reversed. It's the Japanese who are cocky, overconfident. They'd been on a roll for several months. But now the Americans are on their guard. The Americans are paying very close attention. And the Americans frankly outwit the Japanese military in this particular instance, helped by the fact that the Japanese plan itself just wasn't a very good one at all. We talked before about how Pearl Harbor, whatever you want to say about its dastardly nature, was very well crafted. You have to give the Japanese credit for imagination, creativity, stealth, and tactical prowess. The same guy who planned Pearl Harbor, Isoroku Yamamoto, is also the guy who planned Midway. And while people like to praise Yamamoto for Pearl Harbor, well, he deserves some demerits. Maybe a big red F in my part of the world for the Midway plan. Bad in so many ways. For one thing, he gave the commanders who executed the plan two contradictory goals. Goal number one, capture Midway Island. Goal number two, destroy the American fleet. There are lots of sayings out there about going after two hares, fighting a two-front war, etc., etc. It's difficult to be pulled in two directions. In this case, it even comes down to you have to have the right kind of ammunition for these two fundamentally different tasks. I don't want to get too technical, but if you're going to attack land targets, you use what are called high explosive bombs, bombs that explode on impact. But if you're trying to sink ships, you want to use what are called armor-piercing bombs, which will first go inside and then explode, the same kind of projectile you use against a tank, for example. Using one in the wrong circumstance typically leads to ineffectiveness. Well, that's one problem. The other problem is, when it comes right down to it, if you sink the American fleet, Midway is helpless. The fleet should have been the primary goal. Perhaps Chuichi Nagumo, the man in command, the same man who was actually out there at Pearl Harbor, the same man who didn't send in the second wave at Pearl Harbor, that could have really put a hurt into the American war effort. That same guy's command, maybe he could have been smart enough to realize that the fleet was what really mattered. So we got cut off there briefly. Just having two goals is a bad idea in just about everything, particularly when they're pulling you in two different directions. That's not the only problem with the Japanese plan. If you look at the approach of their ships coming across the Pacific, it's very curious to note that Nagumo and his carriers are in the front, followed by the Japanese troop ships, followed by the Japanese battleships. What the Japanese battleships are doing in the rear has puzzled me as long as I've studied World War II. What good were they doing there? None. Nada. All they did in the battle was waste fuel, as far as I can tell. For what it's worth, I grew up playing war games. And I played Midway just like I played Waterloo and Kenai and other battles. And one thing I noticed about Midway games was if you were the Japanese player and you put your battleships in the front, you put the American player in a real dilemma. Because if the battleships come and blast Midway Island, what does the American player do? Respond to the battleships or keep his guard up for the Japanese carriers? Having the carriers up front for the Japanese gave them too many tasks. And having the battleships in back meant that they did nothing. So again, the Japanese plan, Yamamoto's plan, is just not right. And for what it's worth, speaking of war games, just like with Pearl Harbor, the Japanese actually practiced this. They had some war games to kind of see how their Midway plan would go, and in the trial, they lost. The commanders overruled the umpires and said, oh, that couldn't possibly be. There's no way. At Pearl Harbor, they practiced and practiced and practiced until they got it right. With Midway, again, they simply go into it extremely overconfident. They're also, and another bad part of the plan is, they don't have their full force. One of the things that worked for them at Pearl Harbor was they deceived the Americans as to where exactly they would be attacking. They attacked a lot of other places on December 7th, and that tricked American intelligence. They try to do the same at Midway. They also attack the Aleutian Islands. And again, we don't have to have a map here. You know where they are, way up off the tip of Alaska. Japanese High Command apparently believed that by attacking American soil, that the Americans would siphon off some of their defense forces to try and defend that area. Perhaps they didn't realize we didn't have a whole lot of forces left after Pearl Harbor. Or perhaps they thought Alaska really mattered a whole lot to us. Truth be told, we just let them have a few of those islands. Don't have all my notes here today, but I always remember just exactly what the Japanese captured when they took the islands of Attu and Kiska. They captured 10 weathermen, 37 Eskimos, and 2 missionaries. Bless their hearts. We let them have the Aleutians. We let them freeze their keisters up there. And they wasted one of their aircraft carriers in that operation. They had 6 total, counting the one that was damaged at Coral Sea. One of them went to the Aleutians. The one damaged at Coral Sea stayed back in Japan getting repaired. So at Midway, they only have 4, where they perhaps could have had 6. On the American side, we had two, Enterprise and Hornet. Yorktown was in Pearl Harbor getting repaired. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, asked his repair crews, how long is she going to be? And they said, about a month, sir. And he said, you got 48 hours. And so began one of the most heroic performances by our construction people in this entire war. They managed to get the Yorktown ready in a remarkably short amount of time. Now, it wasn't pretty. She listed a little bit, not too bad. And she had to head out a little bit later than Enterprise and Hornet because of the repairs, but so she comes out under a separate battle group, but Yorktown's out there. So it's 4 against 3, but really kind of 4 against 4 because we also control Midway Island. And there is an airfield there, and there are planes based there. And one really good thing about it, kind of a trump card in our pocket, is it's always going to be there. One of the dangers of aircraft carrier war in World War II is carriers don't sit still. So if you take off and go bomb and you come back, you got to find your ship again, which can be a challenge. You know, if the radio isn't working or, you know, whatever. But you always know where Midway is if you're an American pilot. And if worst comes to worst, you can take yourself there and refuel until you can get back to duty. So instead of it maybe being 6-2, it's really 4-4. Again, with the Japanese battleships way back in the rear, not playing a game. Of course, we don't have any battleships because they've all been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. We're using our aircraft carriers because that's all we've got. We know they're coming. Again, at Pearl Harbor, our intelligence was confused. Theirs was spot on. Midway, it's reversed. Our cryptographers have been listening into Japanese codes, and they figured out exactly where the Japanese are coming. They kind of suspected it was Midway all along. To test their theory, they told the guys on Midway Island, hey, send a message out in the open. Something innocuous. Tell us your water distillation is broken down and you need some new parts, right? And so Midway does that. They send this out, and our people listening to Japanese correspondence suddenly pick up that the code target is Midway. They learn that it was called AH in Japanese code. And we don't know what AH was. Well, we got a message that AH was having trouble with the water distillation. Right? Bingo. We know that they're coming to Midway. We've done a lot to even the odds, but we still, have to fight the battle. And a lot is going to depend on who spots the other first. And again, here we get into that question of luck and God's will, because for lots of reasons, the Japanese did not spot our carrier forces until well after we had spotted theirs. They had submarines on patrol, they all missed us. They sent out these rather large flying boats, they all missed. And the carrier force itself sent out search planes. They sent them out in a spoke pattern, like a bicycle. Plane number 4 had engine trouble and didn't take off for a while. Plane number 4 is the one that would have flown right over the American fleet. But it doesn't. So Admiral Nagumo is out looking, and he can't find the American fleet. So he tells his troops to go bomb Midway. Right? He's got this other mission, so we'll go soften up the target for the troop ships that are coming behind. So off they go. They bomb Midway. They encounter some of Midway's planes in defense. They tear them up pretty bad. Our fighter planes back then, fighter planes called the Buffalo, not a real good name for a fighter aircraft, not a real good fighter aircraft. A lot of our guys sadly become casualties. They bomb the island, they do quite a bit of damage, and they come back to their ships. Meanwhile, the Americans have spotted the Japanese fleet, and American planes have headed out to try and bomb. And they've either bombed from high altitude and missed, or some have tried to come in low and gotten shot up, and basically we haven't had much effect. Nagumo still hasn't spotted the American fleet. So his planes come back, and he's, what do I do next? Well, I don't have a fleet, so let's go bomb the island again. So he gets his planes are getting ready to go off again on this second mission. When, in the midst of this getting ready for the second mission, Nagumo finally gets a report from plane 4, which had finally taken off and sure enough had spotted the fleet, part of the American fleet, and radioed back where they were. So Nagumo tells his people, okay, change bombs, change mission. Now we're going after the American fleet. So there's all kinds of ruckus going on the Japanese carriers. They're moving some bombs up from below, they're taking some back down. There's little fuel trucks running around, filling up the planes. There's a whole lot of activity on the decks of the Japanese carriers. About this time, squadrons of American torpedo planes arrive. And they come in low. Our torpedo plane flies in low, tries to drop its torpedo and slide it right into your ship. Sadly, our torpedo planes weren't very good either. Right. Early World War II is a rare case in history where American aviation was not tops in the world. There aren't many examples of that. Ever since the Wright brothers, we've kind of been ahead in that one. But our torpedo planes were kind of slow. One pilot said it was like flying a tired old mule. I mean, there's all kinds of insults out there. But whatever the case, our torpedo planes get shot to pieces. Japanese fighters come down, tear them up. Japanese anti-aircraft guns from the ships tear them up. One particular case, Torpedo Squadron 8, came in with 15 planes, lost all 15. Out of the 30 crewmen, one man, the pilot of plane number 15, survived. His name was Ensign George Gay, and still one of the greatest things that I've experienced in studying World War II is I actually got to meet him. He lived in Columbus, Ohio after the war, and he came and talked to our military history class very early on. And he saw quite a story. He's out there bobbing on his wreckage in the middle of the Japanese fleet, and he got to see the tide of the war turn in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th. Because what happened was an American dive bomber squadron, actually 2 American dive bomber squadrons, show up over the top of the Japanese fleet at precisely the right time. All the Japanese fighters are down low, and they've been shooting up the torpedo planes. All their AA guns are depressed and down low. Their whole attention is down low. Their decks are full of flammable things, and our dive bombers come straight in, down at them from the top. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers are destroyed. And again, there's just an incredible amount of fortune and cleverness involved in this. There's one particular case of one of the squadrons had essentially missed the Japanese fleet. When its commander looked out and noticed a Japanese destroyer just a single ship, and he could tell by its wake that it was going really fast. He told his planes, guys, we're turning around, put yourselves on the bearing of that ship. I think he's trying to catch up to the main fleet. They turn around, and again, they show up at exactly the right time. And they drop their bombs, again, on top of those three carriers. Now the fourth carrier, the fourth Japanese carrier, does manage to launch a counterpunch. Japan has spotted the American fleet. That fourth carrier sends its planes out. And they find the Yorktown out essentially by its lonesome with a handful of escort ships. Again, Enterprise and Hornet were a bit ahead. Yorktown's behind in a smaller battle group. And the Japanese attack does rather serious damage to Yorktown. Doesn't quite sink her. She's going to try to limp back to Pearl Harbor again. She didn't make it, for what it was worth. A Japanese submarine in the neighborhood would finish off the Yorktown. And that ship would be the one carrier that America lost in this battle. But Enterprise and Hornet got their craft in the air again, and they actually sank the fourth Japanese carrier, the Hiryu. So when the battle is done, Japan has lost all four of its carriers, actually a couple of other ships along with it, and all of those skilled pilots that came with those ships. America lost the Yorktown, but the rest of the American fleet is intact. The Japanese transport ships, without air cover, turn away. There is no land invasion of Midway. And the Japanese battleships have done absolutely nothing. This battle just truly turns the tide of the Second World War. In the European theater, certainly Stalingrad is important, and you can argue that El Alamein contributes, and D-Day and Kursk, but there's nothing just quite so completely decisive as Midway in the Pacific. It's not that the Japanese won't build more carriers. They will build 6 more by the end of 1944. During that same time frame, America will build approximately 90 aircraft carriers. Now that's counting what we call light carriers, which are somewhat smaller than a fleet carrier, and also what are called escort carriers, baby carriers, about half the size. But the fact that we're building carriers in 3 different flavors and so many of them is very telling. Once Japan loses the advantage, it's steadily downhill from there. Midway turns the tide. And again, it's so remarkable in so many ways. On paper, they had 86 ships. We had 27 total. They had been on a roll. We had not. And there are so many examples of not just heroism, but intelligence and good fortune that make that battle a very, very special one. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that it puts a little icing on the cake of our World War II adventure. Again, I enjoyed very much getting out and talking to you all this fall. It was just so refreshing to get to do that. And again, I appreciated being invited back.